Today we would like to talk a little bit about Israel, God's clock for the world. I think that's a very up-to-date topic that is relevant to all of us, even though we don't live in Israel, but we live somewhere in the world. So we have to take a look at that. Yeah, let me just start off with a prophecy that Daniel the prophet gave around 538 BC. That's quite a while ago. So over 500 years before Christ, there was a prophet named Daniel, and he wrote some very remarkable things that we would like to talk about tonight. Let's just read some of his writing, what he wrote. The first verse that I want to point out at can be found in Daniel 9:24. And here, Daniel wrote, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to bring in everlasting righteousness. So here, Daniel talks about, of course, a number 70 weeks. And these 70 weeks, Daniel says here, they are determined for his people, Daniel's people. And Daniel, of course, he was a Jew, Jewish. So it is meant to be 70 years, or weeks here, weeks, for the Jewish people and for the holy city. And the holy city here, of course, refers to Jerusalem. So here, the first thing we need to see is that for the Jewish people and for Jerusalem, there is a specific time cut out of a length of 70 weeks. Let's continue. I'll explain more to it later. The next verse says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks." So these 70 weeks up there, they are here further split apart in 7, right? It's right here, plus 62. And here, Daniel the prophet gives us a period of time of the length, of course, here, 69 weeks if you add that together. 7 plus 62 is 69. And he also gives us a starting point of the 69 weeks, and the starting point is the going forth of the command to rebuild Jerusalem. Because you have to understand, at that time Jerusalem was destroyed. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, so it was in ruins. But Daniel the prophet said, there will be a point in time where there will be a command to restore Jerusalem. And then he says here, from that moment on, where the command goes forth to restore Jerusalem, to the end, and what's the end? The end is Messiah the Prince. There are 69 weeks. And of course, Messiah the Prince is maybe familiar to us. The word Messiah is the Hebrew word for Christ. Christ is Greek, and Messiah is Hebrew. So Daniel, and you have to notice that's very amazing, already 500 years before Christ, that's why it's BC, he already mentioned the name of Christ. That's amazing. 500 years before he came, he already knew that he will be coming. And not only did he know that Messiah will come, but he gave a definite time frame when he will come. He says, starting from the command to restore Jerusalem, then you count 69 weeks, and that on that moment, the Messiah as the Prince will be revealed. Now, I'll get into the details in a bit. Now, of course, you have 7 plus 62, it's only 69, but we want to have 70. So there's 1 week missing, right? So Daniel talks about that one remaining week in a In verse 27, and there he says, then with strength he shall make a covenant with many for how long? 1 week. So that's the remaining week. So now you have 7 plus 62 plus 1, 70. We do a little bit of math today, but only elementary math. So this is the calculation of Daniel. Now we want to see how this was, or if this was fulfilled and to what degree it was fulfilled. First of all, let's talk a little bit about the word weeks that Daniel is using here, the weeks. The word weeks in Hebrew actually means Shavuot, so the Hebrew word, and it doesn't really mean weeks as weeks in days, like a week has 7 days. No, but Shavuot simply means a section or unit of 7 each. So it can be 7 anything. 7 years, 7 weeks, 7 months. It's just a unit of 7. Okay? So here in this context, that means the 70 weeks that we were just talking about, they are in fact not weeks, 70 weeks, but they are 70 times 7, which is 490 years. So when Daniel talks about 70 weeks, it's 70 times the unit of 7, which results in 490. And now how do we know it is years and not something else? Well, the main reason, and there are several other reasons, that it is years is because Daniel in his time, he referred to the 70 years of exile in Babylon. Because Daniel, actually, he was a captive. He was at this time, earlier, he was brought as a captive from Jerusalem to Babylon. And we know from the Bible and from the historic records that the captivity in Babylon lasted 70 years. So Daniel, what he's saying is that the people of Israel and the holy city has a time frame of 490 years. Now let's look at that. The first one was 7 weeks. You remember it was 7 plus 62, right? So the 7 weeks correspond to 49 years. 7 times 7. Then there's a long period of 62 weeks, which is 62 times 7 results in 434 years. Right? So in the end, we have the remaining week, which is 1 week corresponding to 7 years. So this is the time block this Daniel is talking about. So altogether, you count that up, it's 70 weeks corresponds to 490 years. Okay? Now, the starting point of this time period was given to us earlier in the verse by Daniel. He says, when the command or the proclamation goes out to rebuild Jerusalem, that's when it starts. Okay? That's when it starts. But he also gave us an end. But he didn't give us the end of the whole thing, but only we saw earlier, the end is of the end of the 69 weeks. And what's the end? It says, Messiah, the Christ as the Prince, enters into Jerusalem. Right? And if you look at the Bible and the book and the Gospels, you'll find out that there was only one point in time where the Jews at that time recognized Jesus as the Messiah. Only once. And that was 5 days before his death on the cross. That's when the people recognized Christ to be the Messiah. And this is exactly the timing point that Daniel is talking about. So, in between, it's easy to see, we have 69 weeks, which is 483 years. And now we go even a step further. We calculate it down all the way to the days. 483 years corresponds to 173,880 days. So how did that number come about? That number comes about as 383 times 360. All right, and why do we use 360? It is because a prophetic year in the Bible doesn't have 365 days like we do, but it has 360 days. Right? And we can check that. The book of Revelation and also the book of Daniel confirm that. So we have, from the time of the proclamation to rebuild Jerusalem all the way to Messiah the King, we have exactly 173,880 days. So you have to think of that. This prophecy was given 530 years before Jesus showed up. Before. And Daniel the prophet has, at that early time, already given us a very exact number all the way down to the days, on the day when Jesus will come. And that's all recorded in the Bible. So the Bible is very, very exact. It gives us an exact number when Jesus Christ will appear. And that's done 530 years before he actually came. That's not easy to do this, but God really is able to do that. Right? And then further, the Bible shows us that the crucifixion of Jesus was actually exactly 5 days after he entered Jerusalem. Yeah? So he entered into Jerusalem and then he was celebrated as the Christ. And 5 days later, he was put to death. We can read that in the reference verses here. Now, what do we want to do? We want to check whether or not this time is really correct. We want to see whether or not Daniel, the prophet, said the right thing about Christ. So what do we need to do? We have to determine the end time. When did Christ enter Jerusalem? When we know that, then we can look at the history to see when did actually the command go forth to rebuild Jerusalem. We can check that also. Now, then we have 2 dates, and then we can subtract them from each other and see whether or not Daniel was right. And that's what we are going to do. So let's start with the end date. When exactly was Christ entering into Jerusalem? What is the date? Can we calculate it? Well, first of all, we can take a look when was Christ crucified, and then we subtract 5 days, and then we will end up right here. Okay? So if we want to know when Christ was crucified, we have at least 3 indications to calculate that. The first one is a historical account, which is in itself written in the book of Luke, in the Gospel of Luke. For example, that's just one verse. There are several others. And you see that in that verse, we're not going to read the whole thing. There are a lot of names showing up, and these names are politicians. You have the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, for example. So the Caesar of the Roman Empire at that time is mentioned here by name also. So, and then Pontius Pilate is there, and Herod is there, and a lot of other people are there. Now, what we can do is we can check in historical records, when did these people actually reign? And you can check that up yourself. When, for example, Tiberius Caesar ruled, it's in the history books, and then you check its 15th year, etc. That's a very exact, that limits the time frame to a very, very small, tiny period. But that's not the only account. We also have an astronomical account, because the Bible says that Christ must be crucified on a Friday, which is the 14th of Nisan. And Nisan here is a Hebrew month, which is the first month of the year for the Hebrews, for the Jewish. For us it's January, first month of the year. But for the Jewish, it's not January, it's Nisan. And Nisan is sometime in the spring, so they don't start in January like we do. They start a little later. And so here, the 14th of the Nisan is the day where Christ is crucified. So all you need to do is, you need to check an ancient Jewish calendar and to find out on which Friday, or on which Friday was the 14th of Nisan. Or when was the 14th of Nisan a Friday? Maybe that's easier to put it this way. When was the 14th of Nisan a Friday? You can check that. So that's the second one. And the third point is geological data that we can look at. Right? For example, you may know, it's also written in the book of Matthew, that there was a great earthquake when Jesus died on the cross. and there was darkness everywhere. It's recorded in the Bible. So what happened that a couple of researchers in geology in year 2012, they found out that there was a couple of earthquakes in the Dead Sea, exactly the area where Christ, of course, Jerusalem is Israel is near the Dead Sea. And so they researched on what earthquakes do we have in ancient, and they can do that, I don't know the methods, how they do it, but you can read this article if you want to. There, they checked all the earthquakes, and interestingly, they found they can determine to the day what earthquake happened at which magnitude at what time. So, and interesting is if you count all these three accounts together, geological, astronomical, and historical, they all have one single date where they all match. And that's the date where Christ was crucified. And this is April the 3rd in 33 AD. April 3rd, 33 AD is the day where Christ was crucified. That's very accurate and very exact. That's a Friday. 3rd April, 3 is a Friday. So now we saw that all we need to do is to determine the entry of Christ into Jerusalem to subtract 5 days. So we take April 3 minus 5, we end up at March 30, 33 AD. On that day, March 30th, 33 AD, Christ entered into Jerusalem on the donkey. You may remember that story. Okay, so what does that mean? Now we determine the end date. The end date of Daniel's prophecy is given by March 30, 33 AD. That's what Daniel was talking about 500 years before it happened. He had that date in mind. So what about the starting date? When was the proclamation to rebuild and restore Jerusalem? Let's look at that. Well, that's the verse again. From Daniel, we had the same one we read earlier in the presentation. From the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Yeah, that's the beginning point. So when did that happen? For that, we can take a look into another book of the Bible. It's called Nehemiah. And in Nehemiah, it is recorded when that command was issued. So Nehemiah says here, it came to pass, and then in the month of Nisan, again, month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. And then he continues on, it pleased the king to send me. To send him where? To send to Jerusalem to rebuild it. So this phrase here is the command that Daniel was talking about. The command was issued by King Artaxerxes, sending Nehemiah to Jerusalem to rebuild the city. You can read the whole book, the Nehemiah is not very long. Very interesting how all that happened. So King Artaxerxes is not only appearing in the Bible, it appears in your history book as well. So if you take a look at Artaxerxes, that's from just a knowledge-based website, you can take a look at that. Artaxerxes was the king of Persia at that time. And when did he reign? It's there. He reigned from 465 to 425 BC. That's when he reigned in Persia. Right? Now, Nehemiah says it's on the 20th year of his reign. Right? So when he started in 40s, you have to now call backwards because it's BC. Yeah, it's minus 465, add 20 years, right? You end up at year 444 because the first year of entering the throne among the Persian kings was never counted. So you start to count at 464, add 20 years, you end up at 444. So the 20th year of King Artaxerxes is year 444 BC. Now, not only the year is given, also the month is given. The month was the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. So we take a look at the month of Nisan in year 444 BC, and we take the first of Nisan as a reference because that's the first day of the month. You calculate and convert that back to our calendar, you end up on March 5th, 444 BC. It's just a conversion from the Jewish calendar to our calendar. So, because we don't know what Nisan is, but we know very well what March is. We converted it. It's just a conversion. Now the Bible records that Nehemiah, before being sent, he was still speaking to the king for a few days, probably 2 or 3 days, to discuss the details of his trip. And then he received the command to restore Jerusalem. So a couple of days later, let's say 3 days, you end up on March 8, 444 BC. And this March 8, 444 BC, is the starting point of the prophecy. So now we have a starting point and we have an end point. And now we have to see how much are these dates apart. Right? So what we do is, because it's a little bit complicated to look at so many days and so such a long time, how many days that is. So there's a nice way to do this. The way is do it just like astronomers do it. And astronomers, what they do is they convert these days to a single number. And they call it the Julian day. The Julian day is a large number, it's over 1 million. And what that is it's actually a very simple concept. They start to count, maybe, they set themselves a starting point. I think it was around 7,000 years ago. And they say this is day 1. And then every time the sun goes down, sun goes up, they just add 1 day. So 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. So, if you start 7,000 years ago, you will, of course, sometime end at very large numbers, right? So, March 8, 444 BC, and by the way, this technique is used by the astronomers when they calculate, their planets and all of that. That's what they use. The Julian day for this is 1,559,319. We do the same thing for that. The Julian day for that is 1,733,199, right? And now all we want to do is to know how many days are in between. We just subtract them from each other, right? You take this number minus this number, and you do the calculation. And lo and behold, you have 173,880 days. Exactly what Daniel the prophet had calculated. Amazing, isn't it? So here you can see how accurate the Bible is. Way before Christ, 500 years before Christ, Daniel gave you on the day a calculation when Jesus will come. That alone should prove to us that the Bible is God's Word. Who can do that? 500 years before I was born, nobody cared. And nobody knew. And nobody knew my name, nor did anyone know my birthday. Mandy, did you know the birthday of Bella before she was born? No, nobody wrote about it, right? But for this one, on the day. This shows us how important and how wonderful God's Word is. Okay, so now what have we seen is this. In the past, the prophecy of Messiah the King was fulfilled exactly to the day. So we have already covered this long block. We have seen from here all the way to the end, it was fulfilled to the day. That was, from our perspective, the past. Now we talk about the remaining 7. What happened to that one? And what does it mean? Well, the remaining 7 is, from our perspective, in the future. It has not yet happened. So, how do we know that? Well, in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament prophets, they did not know anything about the new covenant, which lasts already until today, almost 2,000 years. Right? So, for example, Daniel the prophet and Jeremiah and Isaiah, they didn't know that there was a 2,000-year time in between. They didn't know that. It was hidden. It was not made known to the sons of men. It was not made known to them. They didn't know. So what happened is, now if we zoom that out, you have 69 weeks here. There is a gap in between that and the last week of 2,000 years. And these 2,000 years, no, they didn't know about it. But there's this gap. Right? And we just saw the beginning of that first, now that's just a repetition, was the decree to restore Jerusalem. The end was Christ's entry in Jerusalem. So now, what is the start date and the end of that final 7 here? The last 7 years. Well, we will see shortly. This is written in Daniel 9. With strength he shall make a covenant with many for 1 week. That's again the verse in Daniel. So this is the 1 week. And what does it say here? It says this last 1 week, meaning to say the last 7 years, they start with a covenant. It's written here, a covenant. Right? A covenant is a treaty. It's something that a few parties sign and they get, they get along on something, and then you have a covenant. Like the new covenant. But this covenant is not the new covenant. It is a specific treaty. And if we look into the details and the context, you will see that because this all is written for the Jewish people, as we read, it's for the holy city Jerusalem. That means the last 7 years, they begin with a treaty, with a peace agreement, a peace treaty in or for Jerusalem, for the holy city. Right? And if we read on, and also the book of Revelation, then we find that the end of this 7 years is Christ's second coming. So it's very remarkable. The end of this long block was Christ's first coming into Jerusalem. And the end of the last block of the 7 years is Christ's second coming. So the Bible is it's very, very logical. Now let's talk a little bit about the 7 years. So we zoom those out a little bit in. Begins with the peace treaty, and we have the 2,000 years before. We just talked about that. And it ends with Christ's second coming. Today we live somewhere here, because almost 2,000 years have elapsed. So now the big question is, when does this last 7 years start? Because once it starts, let's say it starts, then this world and this age has 7 years left before Christ will come again to this earth as a judge and as the king. It's very remarkable. 7 years is not that long. So the question is, when does it start? Let's take a look at this. The starting point of that 7 years has actually long been prepared already. The first big preparation was the restoration of the state of Israel. You may know that Israel was not a state for a very long time. Almost 1900 years, there was no Israel on the map. It was wiped out 70 AD by the Romans. And then no Israel until 1948. It was restored. That was a big sign for everybody that the final last 7 years are approaching. And then roughly 20 years later, not only Israel was restored, but Jerusalem, and especially the old part of the city, East Jerusalem, was conquered by the Jews in the so-called 6 Days War, which happened in 1967. In 1967, the Jewish army, the Israeli army, they captured the east part of Jerusalem. That is the second great sign of God given to mankind, that the last 7 years are approaching fast. But now today we are almost more than 50 years after that one happened. It's already a long time. So what is the next signs that happen? One of a very important next sign is a very recent one. 2018. And what happened 2018? In year 2018, President Trump of the United States recognized Jerusalem as Israel's eternal capital. It's an eternal capital. It has not been recognized by most parts of the world, but in 2018 this man had the courage to do it. It's very recent, it was just last year. To have Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is a very important thing in the Bible, because in Jerusalem the great king will rule in the future, which is Christ. So it has to be the capital. And he proclaimed it the capital. They were so happy, the Jews were so happy, that they decided to mint a coin which had on its front side a picture of Trump in the foreground and a Persian king named Cyrus on the background. Cyrus was one of those kings who allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, to Israel. So the Jews at that time, they were so happy that finally there is somebody like Trump who decides to make Jerusalem the capital of Israel, to proclaim it. So they did that. And then a few months later, they came up with a second coin, celebrating the 70th anniversary of Israel. Because it so happened that exactly when Trump moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, it was exactly on the 70th anniversary of Israel. Remember, Israel was founded 1948 in May. And Trump moved the American embassy in May 2018, exactly 70 years after. And 70, as we already heard in the beginning, is an important number for the Bible. That's why they wrote on that coin, to fulfill 70 years. Very recent. So, even more recent is that Trump signed an order to recognize the Golan Heights as part of Israel. The Golan Heights is a northern region in Israel, which is strategically very important, and nobody has ever before recognized it as a sovereign part of Israel. But Trump, in March 25th, it's like a month ago, recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel. That shows a second time how much this president cares for Israel. It's very important. Right? And then for his honor, they even created a new neighborhood in the Golan Heights. It's called Trump Heights. It's a new village. You can go move there if you want to. It was just 3 days ago in the news. That's how much the Jewish people is appreciating what he is doing. And all that is a sign for the last 7 years. Let's take a look at this one here. In 2 days, today's the 20th. In 5 days, there will be a peace workshop in Bahrain in the Middle East, hosted by the Americans. And there, the main topic they want to talk about is the so-called deal of the century. And the deal of the century is a peace agreement, a peace treaty between Jerusalem, or the Jews, the Palestinian people, and actually all the nations in the Middle East. This is called by Trump the deal of the century. What does that deal want to do? That deal wants to reconcile the Jews and the Arabs in the region of the Middle East. So in 5 days, some parts of this deal will be released to the public in the workshop in Bahrain. So another newspaper says, this economic workshop, that's how it's called, will launch Trump's Middle East peace plan. So apparently, Trump is designing a peace agreement which is supposed to last for a permanent peace agreement between Israel and the Arabs in the Middle East. Very amazing that he actually set this as one of his top priorities as a president of the United States. What does that mean for us? That means if this the deal of the century, or you can also call it the Middle East peace plan, it's the same thing. If this is the covenant that Daniel was talking about for the final week of that 70 weeks, if that's the one, okay, then upon signing this peace agreement, the last 7 years of this age will start. So when they decide to make that plan happen, then you can take out a calendar and mark the beginning and count 7 years. Then you have 7 years left. And after 7 years, the Messiah will come back to this earth. And everybody shall see him. Very amazing. So let me summarize this. In May 14th, 48, we had the establishment of the State of Israel as a big sign. In June 67, we had the conquest of East Jerusalem, a very big sign for the coming of Christ. Then, in May 14th, you see, it's exactly the same date, 70 years later, the US embassy opened in Jerusalem, declaring Jerusalem as the eternal capital for Israel. And then, in a couple of days, parts of the peace plan will be revealed. Today, we are somewhere in between, shortly before that, a couple of days before this. So now what does that mean for the 7 years? Well, that means if that deal of the century reenacts the Jewish ceremonial sacrifices on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem for 7 years, then once it's signed, the last 7 years of this age will begin. Right? So if the complete deal of the century of Trump, if that will allow the Jews to reenact, to reestablish their ceremonial offerings on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, and it happens to be a treaty that lasts for 7 years, then you know for sure that the last 7 years started. For sure. That's exactly, it's just as sure as it was for the first part. The first coming of Christ, all the way to the day, the same way it will be for that last 7 years. There's no doubt. This is sure. And at the end, Jesus Christ as the King will come back after 7 years. And we all, each and every man on this earth, even the dead as well as the living people, they have to stand before Jesus Christ to give an account for their life. So suppose that plan will be signed, and it is that plan, and it will be signed, let's say, next year. Let's say, just assuming it will be signed next year. That would mean that Jesus Christ will come back visibly for everybody to see at around year 2027. Okay, if they succeed to close and to make that deal next year, if this is the one. Well, that's not a very long time. And Trump is already working very hard to make that deal happen. You can read the news yourself, although many of the news are sometimes, or most of the time, not so accurate. But keep in mind, that deal of the century will start the last 7 years if it fulfills these requirements, recorded in Daniel chapter 9. Right? So now, concluding, I just want to use one verse that the Bible, Jesus himself said, and is super applicable to us today. It is, Jesus began to preach, and we also should say that, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So when we see how close the coming of Christ really is, then we should really repent, meaning to say, make a turn in our life toward God, toward Jesus Christ, to believe in Him, to be baptized if we're not yet baptized, and to follow His way to the end. Right? It's very important, because when Jesus comes back, we have to be prepared for His coming. We cannot just appear before Him without preparation. It's like here in school, at university. You want to take your midterms or your finals, you better come prepared. So for us, knowing that Christ is so near, I think it is good for us to get ourselves ready. So, that is the conclusion. I would like to invite you for next week. We will have a second topic talking about recent signs in the heavens, the sky, something that we can also observe, which announces the coming of the Messiah again. So we have a very important sign in heaven. Next week, same room, same time, right? And then, of course, we have a couple of meetings here in Toronto. So if you're free to join us to prepare together, you are welcome to join us every Saturday. Every Sunday, we meet at Victoria Park and McNichol area. You can check it out on our website, the church in Toronto. Some of our booklets have the website. You can take it and hopefully see you one of these days, and let's prepare together. Okay, so that's the end for today, but we can still have some snacks and talk questions together. Unless there are some questions now for everybody, we can also talk about it. Does anyone have a question? Is it clear? Or any open issue? We announced this presentation as presentation and Q&A, so if there's any Q's, we hope that there's also some A's. Mandy, clear? Wonderful. Good. Okay, I think let's just have a snack there and continue our fellowship there. Okay, hope to see you next week. Thank you.